When I made it to my home place, I found triumph of the will. Where once lay a shining city, stood a fortress on a hill.
This is Fortress on a Hill with Henry, Danny, Kagan, Giovanni, Shiloh, and Manisha.
Well, welcome everyone to Fortress on a Hill, a podcast about U.S. foreign policy, anti-imperialism, skepticism, and the American way of war. I'm Henry. My pronouns are he and him. Thank you so much for being with us today. With me are my two amazing co-hosts, Giovanni, and one of our new co-hosts, Shiloh Emmeline. How are you guys both doing this afternoon?
You're doing really well, Henry. Thank you.
Doing very well. Excited for this program today.
So we are here with Gretta Zarro and Anna Milosavljevic to talk about just in general the state of the anti-war movement. For the last 20 years, the U.S. has been on the war path, either directly or by proxy. Despite an American plurality against wars and the sources wasted in them, the war machine continues, facilitated by both parties taking turns in office. It is estimated that America's Middle East wars have displaced over 50 million people, and in Iraq alone has taken over 1 million souls. Yet the current administration is playing a dangerous game of chicken with nuclear-armed Russia as it continues to escalate a grueling conflict in Ukraine, and still has an appetite to create tension in the Far East with nuclear-armed China. So we want to discuss is what is the state of the anti-war movement in all of this. First, we have Gretta Zarro, has a background in issue-based community organizing. Her experience includes volunteer recruitment and engagement, event organizing, coalition building, legislative and media outreach, and public speaking. Gretta graduated as valedictorian from St. Michael's College with a bachelor's degree in sociology and anthropology. She previously worked as New York organizer for leading nonprofit Food and Water Watch. There, she campaigned on issues related to fracking, genetically engineered foods, climate change, and the corporate control of our common resources. Gretta and her partner run Unadilla Community Farm, a nonprofit organic farm and permaculture education center in upstate New York. And Gretta is now the organizing director at World Beyond War. Gretta, welcome to Fortress on a Hill.
Thanks so much for having me.
And next we have, I'm going to try to say it again, Anna Milosavljevic, who is an anti-war activist from Boston, who in the past 4 years helped to organize protests against war profiteer recruiting on college campuses, against the war with Iran after the assassination of General Soleimani, and against U.S. involvement in the ongoing war in Yemen. She is now studying journalism in Lisbon, Portugal. Anna, welcome to Fortress on a Hill.
Great to be here.
All right. Giovanni, you're up, man.
Thank you both. Thank you both for coming. I'm excited about this call. I just wanted to start asking you about your organizing. What drove you to the anti-war and peace activism? Let's start with Greta.
Yeah, so I guess my path was an interesting one. So my parents had an organic food store when I was growing up, and that was really my introduction into looking at various issues, and that in that case through the lens of the food system, looking at the environmental impacts of our food choices, of course, social, cultural impacts, and health impacts. And then growing up, I became a vegetarian, and I was kind of exploring, how can we make change in all these different ways. And I always sort of had this desire to make change on the systemic level. I knew I wanted to do something. I thought about different career paths. So maybe I could be a nutritionist or a fitness trainer or something. But I thought I want to do something broader on the systemic or structural level. And then fast forward a lot, I was in grad school studying food studies, and I took a internship with Food and Water Watch. And that was really my introduction to what is organizing, and the notion of being able to organize ourselves and get people together to use their people power to put pressure on elected officials and other decision makers to make policy changes. And I really related to that. I loved the power of organizing. So I was an intern with Food and Water Watch, and then later took a job with Food and Water Watch, and was mostly, as my bio says, was mostly working on issues of food and water, like GMO labeling and fracking, and the impact of those on our food system. And then at the same time, you'll hear me speak a lot about what I call my two-prong approach. So at the same time as I was kind of getting involved in all this policy stuff, I was also seeking very sort of tangible level change on the ground in my life. And so I discovered WWOOFing, which is the Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms. And I had grown up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I had no background of a rural environment at all. And this was in college. I started WWOOFing and, kind of really learning those hands-on skills of how do we grow our own food and living off the grid and that kind of thing. And so then I wanted to blend the two concepts of structural change and on the ground change. And again, fast forward sort of, I ended up getting involved with Unadilla Community Farm in upstate New York, which is where I currently live. And I run, it's a nonprofit farm education center. And so I was at one point sort of splitting my time between New York City working with Food and Water Watch and also trying to spend time on the farm upstate. Eventually made the decision to move full time to the farm, and then had to leave my job at Food and Water Watch. And then I was looking for something that I could do remotely. And that's when I discovered World Beyond War, which allowed me to work remotely and still do the organizing work that I love, but from the farm off grid. And it was really, I had no background in peace or anti-war activism. My background was in this environmental kind of food system work. But I immediately realized the intersections between all of these things and how the war system is really connected as I'm sure we'll talk about too, environmental destruction, climate change. It's all sort of one corrupt capitalist system that has all of these different tentacles. And World Beyond War really spoke to me because we do take that intersectional approach. So that's how I got involved. That's how I got to work with World Beyond War. And here I am 5 years later.
Thank you. Awesome. Anna.
Yeah. So my path to anti-war, anti-imperialist journey or organizing was that my parents actually immigrated from Serbia during the wars of the 90s. So I grew up learning a lot about the disastrous role the U.S. played there. The U.S. bombed its hospitals, factories, infrastructure. And so there was a lot of devastation that I even saw when I would go there to visit my family. I remember as a kid driving around in downtown Belgrade, the capital, and there were still buildings that were bombed and just decimated in the center from the U.S. bombing campaign. So I grew up learning from my family a lot about the role that the U.S. plays globally. And realized, through that and by growing up that Serbia was not an anomaly actually, and that's really how the U.S. operates globally, which is by bullying smaller, poorer countries, both economically and militarily, to bend to the interests of the U.S. elite. So I had that personal connection, but also saw that, there was really a dire need for people in the U.S. to be organizing against the madness. So around 2018, I got involved in organizing in Boston against the U.S.'s involvement in the war in Yemen in particular. But then, as was mentioned, and we'll talk about, participated in some other organizing against the war with Iran and other things that we'll talk about. But yeah, that's a little bit about how I got here.
Interesting. I was deployed to a former Yugoslavia in '96, and a matter of fact, Greta invited me to a panel once, and on that to talk about that and the role of NATO, etc. That was NATO's first actual war, right?
Yep.
And the channel, there was someone also from the region. I believe she was from Serbia as well, and she was talking about she was describing, because she was actually in it with the bombing. She was describing how everything went down. I think she lost both her parents during the bombing. She was raised by grandparents. Is that what it was, Greta?
I can't remember the details, sorry, but I do remember her describing being a child as the bombs were falling.
Yeah.
fascinating. We'll have to talk about that more, but
Let's move along. We wanted to have this discussion is we wanted to talk about the state of the American anti-war or peace movement. Where they at, what's the state of it today. I follow World Beyond War a lot. Follow David writing. And I went to a convention or conference they had back in I believe it was in 16. Was it Greta? That's where we met.
That was No War 2018 in Toronto.
2018, yes. So I've been following. So in one of the interviews that David was participated in, he was asked the same question: what's the state of the American anti-war movement? Where they at? He said that it's still alive, it's still there. Problems, there are challenges, but it's still there. And he gave a couple examples of things that have I've heard, and actions and successes with the anti-war movement. But I'm asking you, right? Most people are anti-war in principle, but do you feel they are anti-war in action? Do you feel that most of the activism here in the United States tend to neglect this factor, right? Do you feel that it's a priority for activists here in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I can just chime in. I feel in the US, I think it's a big challenge for us as an anti-war organization or anti-war movement to activate people because war is far off, right? People don't see war in their day-to-day lives. It's very different than the Vietnam era where there was the draft and the visuals on the mainstream media of the war. So I think that our challenge as organizers is to make war visible. And we can do that in many ways through storytelling, through having the webinars like the one you described, Giovanni, with you and Ana Maria Gaur talking about that firsthand experience of war. I think that also our challenge is, in organizing, we say, meet people where they're at, connect to something that resonates with them. So if war is this far off concept and feels like a complicated geopolitical thing, well, what does resonate with people? Is it their pocketbooks hurting and the economic state of the US? Is it climate change? And then sort of our role as organizers is to connect the dots between those things and talk about how war is one of the leading contributors to climate change, how war is sucking $2 trillion a year globally, and to connect those dots and make it feel like something that matters to them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not really sure that most people in the US are even anti-war in principle. The war propaganda is so strong that I think a lot of people see US wars, especially if there's no troops deployed, as a way for the US to, promote freedom and democracy. And we see that rhetoric constantly in the media. So I think one of the key tasks for the anti-war movement is to educate people on the reality. What is the US doing around the world with 800 plus bases? And clarify that actually what it is doing is not in the interest of most people. The people benefiting off of US hegemony are CEOs and politicians. It's not everyday people. So I think we need to really work to put that at the forefront and connect that to people's everyday struggles. And in terms of in the activist community, I think it's very tricky because there are activists working on this, but especially when Obama was elected, the anti-war movement just fell asleep. And, he was elected on all these false promises that people just accepted. And even when, he continued and escalated all of the same wars, people were not stepping up to really question and oppose him in the same way as when Bush was around. And I think the same thing has unfortunately happened now with Biden, that a lot of the people that were vehemently opposed to different wars under Trump are silent. And I think it's an indictment of the larger political system because Biden's policies are just a continuation of Trump's, which are continuation of Obama's. And, this goes beyond war, but also touches things like immigration and the opioid crisis and healthcare and so many other things. But I think that's the kind of broader point that we have to struggle through with people.
And just to clarify what I said, people are in principle against war in the United States is that, like you mentioned, when Obama ran, he ran against the war of Iraq and they got all the support. And and all this vote and everything, like you said, a lot of the anti-war groups that were active during the Bush era, seemed to be not so much anti-war, but mostly anti-Bush, right? But they voted for Obama because of his rhetoric against the war in Iraq, which at the time was very visual in the media and stuff like that. Trump ran on the same thing. Trump ran on the same thing. Calling out Hillary Clinton's, warmongering, calling out, Obama's warmongering, calling out even Bush, his own party, Jeb Bush. And if you remember one of the debates, he called out Jeb Bush and his brothers warmongering in Iraq and everything. So you saw a lot of people who identify as conservative, right? Supported Trump or because of his what seems to be anti-war rhetoric at the time. But the same thing was continuation, right? Then you got that's what I mean by principle. But people at principle are against war, but in action, might say some different. Shala, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a follow-up question around, I'm not sure how connected the two of you are with like younger activists, but I was curious if you are, like, what differences do you see in young people today in their views of war and militarism as opposed to like generations before them or our generation and so on?
Sure, yeah. I guess, do you want to go first or should I? Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say from what I see, and especially so with my farm hat on, we run an internship program for young people in usually like 18 through 25 roughly. And so we get a lot of people coming through that program. And what I'm seeing is that in my generalization, is that those young people are really interested in kind of the hands-on work that I was talking about, what I'll label as like regenerative work. And we also saw that like with COVID, with the growth of the mutual aid networks. And I feel like there's this craving. And I also, as a young person, I also say, I'm speaking for myself as well. There's this craving for, things that are concrete, that are tangible, that we can change in the here and now. Sort of almost lifestyle changes, but beyond that, community level changes as well. And I think for me and from others that I talk with, I think it's also kind of a reaction to the fact that we see like Washington as gridlock, like as we just talked about, like it doesn't matter who's in office, right? These same policies are continuing, Republican, Democrat. And so while Washington is gridlock and it seems like our politicians are corrupt, we can make these, on the ground changes to basically create the alternative system that we want to see. So that's where I see a lot of young people kind of moving in that direction. And then also, of course, we see relatedly, young people really involved in the climate justice movement and also in social justice struggles, racial justice struggles. And all of these things are interconnected as we're talking about. It's all, and the war machine is at the nexus of all of this. But I think that people don't necessarily use that framing. And I think that's our challenge, is to, again, kind of connect the dots. And when I talk to, for example, interns in our farming program and talk about my World Beyond War work, they instantly usually agree with me and see this whole interconnection, but they don't necessarily label themselves as anti-war activists. Maybe more, I would say, anti-imperialist or anti-capitalist. So I think, again, kind of trying to bring all these pieces together is the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also there's a distinction for me between, in general, young people, let's say students in universities or something like that, they tend to be, I think, pretty apathetic and pretty focused kind of on their careers. And a lot of them actually now, for example, were born when, the occupation of Afghanistan started. So like they don't even know a time when there was, anything different, and these wars have just been endless. And so this is, I think, a bit different and more heightened than, let's say, the Vietnam era. I think a lot of, older folks that were participating in that movement, there's a very different, climate and atmosphere. But yeah, I agree with Greta in the space of people who are already coming forward and kind of participating and organizing. People are pretty excited and about linking imperialism and these issues to, capitalism, and what is the system about and how do we actually come together to transform it. So that's, I think, definitely, it's great to see.
Define imperialism. I know both of you use the word imperialism, and it's a word that gets thrown around a lot, but I'm not sure people actually understand what that means.
Yeah. So to me, the difference between anti-war and anti-imperialist is that people who are anti-imperialist are not opposed to all wars, especially ones of liberation. That's the key difference for me. Whereas anti-war is, people in those spaces can tend to say, they're pacifists and stuff like that. But anti-imperialist is, I think, different. It's more against imperialism and capitalism as a system that, dominates peoples around the world. So that's the difference for me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I guess maybe building off of that, like maybe in the past, usually imperialism is like essentially colonialism, right? Invading another country often is what it's associated with. But I think also like what you're getting at, Anna, is like it's this larger thing now, like as we live in a globalized world, like when we throw around that term, I think that many of us are talking about something beyond the nation state, this sort of larger multinational conglomerate system, capitalist system.
Absolutely. I think that's a really key point because, imperialism it has changed a lot over like the last 100 years. But before there were colonies and kind of direct subjugation of people and exploitation. And now it's a little bit more subtle in the sense of, what I would say is neocolonialism, where a country is nominally independent, but their government serves the interests of a larger power, China, the US, Russia, what have you. I think that's a really important distinction because I think a lot of people think of imperialism as simply that, just colonialism. And it's completely, shifted now.
And talking just about the anti-war movement overall, that I kept thinking about how the different social indicators for the average American citizen to worry about that, like they would have had with bodies coming home from Vietnam, or even, the news coverage of like the first Gulf War or the beginning of Operation Iraqi Freedom, that we've gotten so good at developing war that isn't war actually waged by Americans. And beyond dead Americans coming home or potentially wounded ones, what else are Americans going to find value in that they're going to say, this is wrong, I want something to change, or at least I want to understand the situation, between things like sanctions, between things like special operations forces that can have little lily pad bases that can come up in a short time and also leave in a short time. The use of drones, that we have gotten so good with the tiny force we have now compared to, say, the Vietnam era, but it is also completely suctioned off what the things I think most people would look for in terms of deciding they're going to oppose a war, especially because and the biggest part of that is because Americans are so ignorant of the imperialist nature of our country, of all the things that we're actually doing, of creating economic systems in places where U.S. corporations take over and any agency that the people that live there would have had is now gone. Ordinary Americans aren't looking for these things. They're not worried about that kind of stuff.
And as you're speaking, for me, it's just kind of bringing me to the word of othering, right? And the fact that these other countries, that there's cultures are othered, and it's as you said, it's sort of off the American radar, right? There's no reason for them to necessarily care about that. And so I think that's kind of our job as activists, and like World Beyond War, especially being a global network. That was really central when we were founded, was to be a global network. And we knew that we can't just be from one country alone calling for the abolition of the entire institution of war, but that we needed this global movement from all aspects, from those whose countries are the invader, and from those who are on, the invading side, and from everyone, to talk about the impact of the war machine, especially the U.S. war machine. And so, part of our work is kind of citizen to citizen diplomacy and, cultural exchange, and just the value of having webinars and international networks that we can do now with technology, to try to kind of humanize the other.
Going back on imperialism, so I found here Lenin's 5 characteristics of imperialism, right? 1, the role of economic concentration. 2, the dominance of finance capital. 3, the importance of capital export. 4, the spatial stratification of the world as a result of corporate dominance. And 5, the political dimensions of the spatial stratification of the world. So those were the characteristics that he gave back in the early 20th century. He said, Anna, the world has changed a lot throughout this past 100 years. Back then, there were different centers. There were several centers of capital. Back then, you had the British, you had the French, Portuguese. But today, it seems to be more blurred, like you mentioned earlier. The centers of capital used to be around the globe. It used to be dominated by just a handful of different corporate entities.
No, that's helpful. Yeah. I mean, I think his words still ring true today. I mean, the core, I think, is consistent, but, back then it was primarily through, colonies and, through the different liberation or struggles throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s. That's changed. And now, it's a bit more discreet, but I think at the core, at the root, it's the same system operating.
So as far as resisting war, is kinetic war the only method of war activists should be concerned with? Or should activists also, be keen to the other ways of making war, creating harm, like economic war, information wars, cyber war, lawfare, diplomatic war, psychological war, war by proxy, funding oppositions to destabilize. And all these are elements of post-generation warfare or hybrid war. How do you see this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are all really important aspects too that we need to be educating people about. Sanctions, especially, you mentioned that's something that we work on and do fact sheets and webinars on. And there are many groups who are dedicated just to that issue. But I think, this question relates to everything we've just been talking about in terms of imperialism and the sort of amorphous global capitalist way that it takes shape in all of these different facets and, the control of the media and all of that. So it's all related and it's all something we need to be working on. And I think it just, emphasizes the importance of education. And for World Beyond War, we have these two prongs of education and action. First, debunking what are the myths of war, debunking what people are seeing on the mainstream media, providing that storytelling from firsthand accounts and through various educational materials to educate and then put that knowledge into practice through activist campaigns. So that's really a big part of our role as activists is basically making our own media, as we are doing right now through this podcast, to put out a different narrative. And we've seen so many exciting and creative ways that that's happening, like with the growth of Substack and other platforms that have allowed people to start getting out a different narrative.
Yeah, I agree. I think they're all crucial elements of it and of the U.S. war machine, especially, for example, diplomacy, because I think things like that can be used to really deceive people into thinking the U.S. is actually a force for good, but it's not. It's just another way for the U.S. to try to secure its interests. Really good example of that is the Iran nuclear deal. The U.S. went into this, I don't think out of the kindness of its heart, but really to try to buy off a section of the Iranian elite to, be subservient to U.S. interests. And ultimately, the issues in terms of the U.S. kind of led to that being scrapped. And even now, it's not actually clear if that's going to ever happen again, especially with the role of China in the region. And even, I think it was just today that Iran and Saudi Arabia kind of have outlined potentially normalizing ties. And it seems like China has played a role there as well. So things are really kind of spiraling for the U.S. in that sense. But I think diplomacy in that sense, needs to be exposed for what it is. And then just a little bit on the sanctions as well. I think the sanctions on Russia in particular are a key way to expose this to people because the sanctions actually haven't hurt Russia. They've mainly actually strengthened it and forced other countries to trade with them in the ruble. And, with that, it's hurt people, for example, in Germany and other places all around the world because the sanctions are cutting them off from access to Russian goods and all of that. So what is that really about? I think we have to be pulling that front and center with people.
Yeah, just to reiterate what you're saying is that, and what Greta said, there are groups that are dealing with educating people with sanctions, right? I think like over 40 countries, over 40 countries are being sanctioned, right? The majority of those sanctions are countries in the global south who depend on global north capital to develop. But by sanctioning it, you pretty much cutting them off from core center capital. And you pretty much, it's a way of collective punishment to the whole entire population, because now the country pretty much is immiserated. They're pushed more into poverty because of these sanctions, right? Russia, you mentioned, right? It's the first time actual country that size have ever been sanctioned, to this point. I mean, I think Russia right now leads the world as the most sanctioned country in the world. And because of that, the other sanctioned countries, right, are pretty much consolidated around this Russia, China and stuff like that. And because of that, the sanction regime that was then used against poor nations pretty much is losing its ability to continue this way of war making.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very much what's happening, and really relates to the overall imperialist system, which I think there are some serious fractures right now. And I think we can all agree that, the fracturing of a US dominated imperialist system is not a peaceful process. So there's a lot to really mobilize around and oppose in so many senses.
Hello.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. I guess we wanted to ask more specifically, Anna, about your work with the war in Yemen and bringing attention to the assassination of General Soleimani and the consequences there. So how do you feel these two issues have been dealt with or presented to the American people, and also dealt with by activists and the anti-war movement?
Yeah, I think with the upsurge that happened after the assassination of Soleimani was really noteworthy. I mean, I know in Boston there were huge demonstrations against it. Something we never saw and didn't ever see in opposition to the war in Yemen, for example. But people, I think, rightly saw that a potential war between the US and Iran would be devastating. And but I think there was a failure again on the part of the anti-war movement to, translate that upsurge into a larger movement and consistent organizing with people that stepped forward. So I think that was a big issue that needs to be talked about. And I think it relates to some of the other things we wanted to talk about around like silos and some of the stuff that came up with the Rage Against the War Machine. But in terms of the war in Yemen, I mean, I think there's still not really any substantial movement. I mean, there's been people who are organizing against it for the last 6-7 years who are still doing it. But in terms of widespread opposition in the US public, which actually I think polls show most people don't support it, but that obviously doesn't always translate to people getting involved. So that's a real barrier, just because, I mean, the US is supporting the Saudis. It's not, troops on the ground, but it's basically US war in in all of their senses. What I've found actually is a key issue on this is the real hypocrisy by these so-called progressives and Democrats who denounced this war when Trump was in office, but now that Biden is in office, refuse to do anything, refuse to say anything, do anything. And I think, again, without calling them out and without staying, vigilant about the opportunism of politicians, the anti-war movement is not going to advance. So I think that's something that's really come up with Yemen in particular. Some are just not willing to go there. They kind of would rather stay silent on the Democrats. But then if there's a Republican, attack them. And I just don't think that's really going to get us this, the support we need.
Greta, go ahead, Greta.
Oh, well, I was just nodding my head in agreement. And I mean, it was a historic moment, right, under the Trump administration when the war powers resolution was passed. That was incredible. But it was only passed because they knew Trump would veto it. And then now they won't put it up for a vote. That was just, really, really disheartening when Bernie wouldn't put it up for a vote under Biden's administration.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So talking about media, you mentioned media earlier, Greta. And we mentioned earlier the anti-war movement back in, particularly in the 60s. There was another act before the 60s. There was another one in the actual in the early 20th century, big one. I guess against the First World War. But talking about the anti-war movement in the 60s, right? So back then we had like 1,000 newspapers, right? Country had over 1,000 newspapers, right? But there were only hundreds of thousands of people come out, for to end the war in Vietnam. And back then we had about over 1,000 newspapers, right? But we only had like three television channels, right? ABC, NBC, and what's the other one? ABC, NBC. I forgot the other one, right? 4 with the public with PBC, right? With the public network, public television, right? So everyone was watching the same thing. But even with the lack of, with the media that we had back then, people still came out in the troves in the thousands, and they were all across the country, the Washington lawn, they were just, all these speakers come out, Martin Luther King, those people came out, all these organizations. There was like a real ecosystem of different organizations, working together and to end the war, to put pressure on Johnson on Nixon to end the war in Vietnam, right? Today, we have like the huge ecosystem of information, right? We have social media, we have all these, we have like over 1,000 different channels on Netflix and we have all this media. We have like an abundance of media now, right? But it's difficult to get people out, Can you talk about that contradiction here?
Yeah, well, I mean, in one sense, it's information overload. You can open up your phone and read about any problem happening in any corner of the world. And it's like, there's thousands of problems. What do we put our attention to? So I feel like that's one aspect of this. And the other, of course, is the corporate control of the media and the fact that the talking heads that we're seeing on the media are often, former people from the government, former elected officials, former government administrators who are now put up as the talking heads on the media. So it really comes down to our job, again, as activist organizations to create our own media to through storytelling, through webinars, podcasts. World Beyond War runs online courses as well. So I think that's our big challenge, is to break through. And I think another thing I was going to flag is just that I think even for those who may agree with us, one of the challenges with anti-war organizing, maybe in comparison with other issues, is that, again, it feels so large and it's this huge sort of geopolitical dilemma. And how can we actually make a difference? And so one of the things that I try to focus on is breaking it down into smaller, concrete, tangible steps that people can actually make a difference on. And in my mind, the thing that that resonates with me is divestment, because we can really make a difference on the individual level, the institutional level, or municipal level, divesting from weapons manufacturers. So that's just one example of a campaign that we work on. But I think that's our big challenge too, both the media you're talking about, but then also okay, once we get someone to care, what can we actually plug them into where they feel like they're going to make a difference on these huge issues?
Yeah, I think there is a lot more media, but at the same time, I think most of it is owned by a few corporations, right? And so it has changed, but it hasn't, I think. And for me, I think the reason things were different back then is also related to, the Black liberation struggle was kind of really ramping up and pulling people in, and like, working people were involved in these struggles, and as well as like the world situation was different, right? There were a lot more liberation wars, all around the world against colonialism. And I think, back then in the 60s, particularly, China was still a socialist country, and it was kind of leaning in a lot of ways, and that obviously has changed. But I think there's a lot of elements of that period that allowed for and contributed to the reason that the anti-war movement then was so much more successful. And we certainly need to learn a lot from that. I just think with the media now, I mean, it's so corrupt. Like, the only place you can hear a view against U.S. involvement in Ukraine is Tucker Carlson's show. I mean, what does that tell you, really? Like, it's ridiculous.
I don't know, and because I see a lot of intellectuals and a lot of generals and a lot of, on Twitter and you're just twittering away and sharing all these articles and stuff like that. I'll give you an example, right? We're talking about social media now. So when Evo Morales was overthrown, right, a few years back, right, through a parliamentary coup, they called it now, right? It's not cool. So we called it out here in San Antonio. The groups I was, involved here. So we called it out online, and we wanted to do a rally downtown, right? We set out the call, we set out the press, we did a press release and everything. We had a Facebook page, we had almost 100 people right saying, "I'll go, we're going," right? The day of the rally, 16 people showed up. From 100 people, how do you go from 100 people just to 16 people showing up?
So what are you saying is the reason?
There's more, like you said, it's like talking about the information overload and everything, but it's just what does it take to get people out,
Yeah. I mean, it's really discouraging. I mean, I have a lot of experience where you go to a protest and there's 5 of you, 10 of you, maybe. It's just really discouraging, I think. But it really underscores the need to make links with working people, I think, people who really, really don't have an interest in the system in the US, nor the imperialism of the US government abroad, I think that's what is missing for me. And, it takes a lot. I'm not saying it's easy, but yeah, I mean, I hear you. It's really tough.
Yeah, I think also don't get too discouraged, because in organizing, we have the term organizer math, which is essentially called the math of PABs. And there's this whole calculation you can do. Like if you want, 20 people to show up, you need 40 people to RSVP yes. If you want 40 people to RSVP yes, you need 80 people who you contacted or whatever. And it multiplies. So it just shows you like how many people you need to contact and how that trickles down between those who say yes and then those who actually show up. And so when I'm helping our chapter coordinators around the world, I always remind them of that and say, like, don't get discouraged. That's just like an aspect of organizing that we have to be aware of. And that, then you have to kind of figure out your targets for how many you want to show up and how many you have to reach. But I think it also connects to what we're talking about in terms of, finding actions that resonate with people, finding things that they actually feel are worth their time. And I think in some ways, like the tactic of a rally is very overused. And so people might say, wow, another rally, like what's that going to do? And I think there's certainly a time and place for rallies. I don't want to say that you should never do a rally, but I just mean to kind of put it into that context and to think about like the larger campaign strategy and when certain tactics make sense. And again, what is going to be compelling to people that they feel it will actually be effective and worth their time to show up.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think there's a need to discuss and debate various tactics. I think for me, it's also really primary. What is the content of the actions and the tactics, right? Because I think if people see the basis to support or oppose a certain war or something like that, the tactics are secondary. I think they're important, but I think the content and how you relate what the issue is to their lives and why it is essential that they take a stand and organize. I think that's also fundamental to this question. But yeah, I think you bring up good points too.
I wanted to follow up on something that you mentioned, Anna, around like the only like mainstream media you can find speaking out against the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine and Russia is Tucker Carlson and Fox News. And we spoke a little bit earlier about how like Trump ran as the supposed anti-war president, claimed that his whole presidency, blah, 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 which we know is just on face value, just bullshit. But I wanted to know like what your thoughts on the right kind of taking an anti-war stance, kind of somewhat like infiltrating the anti-war movement a bit. And then what other critiques do you have of the anti-war movement, specifically in the US, but globally, as I know you're in Portugal now?
Yeah, no, it's a very important question. Where to start? Well, I think that the right having these different anti-war sentiments is reflective actually of their base, their so-called base, having them, in rural America, and people who, paid the price with these wars. Their kids went and died, and a lot of people from that base are against it. And so, as is the case with the Democrats, I think the Republicans want to co-opt it and use it for their own means. But I think it is reflective of that real material basis to reach out and try to work across political spectrums, which is why I thought, I do think Rage Against the War Machine was such an important initiative and protest, and hopefully one of many. But yeah, I think, these people are obviously opportunists and they're not anti-imperialists. Like, you even have Matt Gaetz sponsoring legislation to end U.S. involvement in Syria, right? I mean, I think that should be supported. He's not an anti-imperialist, and certainly is not a friend of the people, I think. But yeah, I just think it reflects deeper anti-war sentiments that are left unlocked really by the anti-war movement, because it is so sectarian, or some people in it are very sectarian, unfortunately. So yeah, I don't know. I think there was more to it. If you want, hopefully that also helped him as a starting point.
Greta, do you have any, just like general critiques of the anti-war movement, and what do you think could, do you have any possible like resolutions or thoughts on what to do about it?
Well, I agree with Anna's analysis. I mean, I live in a very, very rural place, and so I can affirm what you're saying in terms of my neighbor's sentiments. And rural America is hurting economically, and there's been a migration over the past 50 to 100 years into urban centers. Things are crumbling in the rural sphere. So I agree with you. There is that sentiment of possible anti-war, or even broader, just kind of like fed up with the system, and Trump obviously fed off of that sentiment. And so part of what we do, at the farm actually is like building those bridges. Like, yeah, we may not agree with every single point, of other people in our neighborhood, but where can we find that common ground? And for different reasons, I think that, I was drawn to live in a rural area and start a farm and try to be self-sufficient. It's kind of a similar sentiment for them, right? It's like both of us are critiquing the system and trying to get away from it and, build a sense of independence and self-sufficiency. And with my World Beyond War hat on, also we have a nonpartisan view. We're not associated with any political party, and we aim to draw people in from across the political spectrum, from a global perspective, just from all different backgrounds. And we work with people who may have wildly different views from each other on certain things, like especially if you sort of talk about hot button issues like abortion or something, right? They may have very different views, but they can come together and they can work with World Beyond War because of that mutual interest in war abolition. So that's something that we're trying to cultivate. And I think, to your point, Anna, it's very difficult because of the partisanship and the divisions especially in U.S. society today. And it's, there are people, right, who just won't work with the other, and they won't work with anyone, who doesn't share their view on all these issues. And David Swanson, our executive director, when speaking about why he chose to speak at the Rage Against the War Machine rally, he said, basically he never agrees with like every point of the people that he's speaking with, like at a rally or at a panel or something. Like, he's not going to be ever on an event where he agrees 100% with the other people. So just to say, like, you have to agree with everyone, like you would never be able to speak at any event. And so again, we just try to find common ground where we can. And in that case, for that event, we agreed with all the demands. The demands were actually really strong, including abolishing the war machine, which many groups won't go so far as to include that demand. And that's very much in alignment with World Beyond War. So that's why we were part of it, to try to build that big tent approach, to try to find commonality, at least on this narrow issue of war abolition. And, if you're asking me to sort of critique, and I guess I'm sort of segueing into that event, but I think one thing, I wasn't there, but watching the whole rally on YouTube, I was a little bit concerned, or one critique was just that some speakers, I think, did deviate off and they started talking about other issues that were not necessarily central to the demands. And I think some controversial issues like vaccines and other things, which I personally didn't feel it was the place to delve into that. So I would say that they should have focused more on the core demands. And I think David, our executive director, did a really great job of coming in and providing that abolitionist perspective that actually really was a core demand. So yeah, those are just some thoughts.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, right, which is interesting, right, and talking about NATO now, right, when the price of the Ukraine started back in, February 24, 2022, there were lots of discussion, right, and how to respond to the conflict, right. There was a lot, there was some discussions and whatnot, and unfortunately, I was, some of the minorities of the discussion, right, but some of the orgs, that will participate in the discussion. Right? I'm name one, DSA, for example, right? Who in the past critiqued NATO, but overnight just rehabilitated NATO and then became apologists for NATO, right? And this is not the first time it happened, but it was very disappointing from my part. People that I've been with, and, hearing the discussions, all of a sudden they were talking about, sanctions. All of a sudden they were talking about no-fly zones, which no-fly zones is actually attacked. But yeah, how do you feel about that?
Well, wow. I mean, yeah, I would love to see that, what they said, because wow. But because I think in the US, we especially have a role to play in clarifying actually what was NATO's role in causing this war and provoking this war, right? I think clear that doesn't justify a Russian invasion, and no one here is saying that, but also you can't, what's the phrase? You can't call the pot black when you're pan. I don't know. But anyways, so the hypocrisy is very evident, and people in the US, we need to be clarifying that to people. Otherwise, we are just promoting US imperialism and ultimately, nuclear war, which is what's on the line here right now. So yeah, that's really outrageous, but yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And World Beyond War often takes this nuanced stance, which we all are taking in this show, which is, yeah, exactly what you just said, Anna. We are not condoning the Russian invasion from World Beyond War's perspective. We oppose all wars from anybody at any time, but at the same time, we have to provide that context too and talk about NATO's involvement, talk about the US's involvement. So it's a nuanced stance. And we have just found that people can't handle that. There's very few who can. It seems that, again, it kind of gets back to just the divisiveness in our society, especially in the US these days. And it's just very black and white thinking. And if you say that you oppose sending weapons to Ukraine, then all of a sudden you're a Putin apologist. And there's no middle ground. And so the slogan that we've been using at World Beyond War, which David said at the Rage Against the War Machine rally, is Russia out of Ukraine, NATO out of existence. And I think that really sums up our position. And it was funny at the rally when David started that phrase and he said Russia out of Ukraine. I sensed there was almost a moment of hesitation, a gasp, because nobody was really critiquing Russia at the rally. So it's like, whoa, that was a different perspective in a way. But then he circled back around and said, and NATO out of existence. And then the audience clapped and got on board with that. And so I just think it's really important to have those two perspectives together and to have this nuanced stance. And that has had been a big challenge over the past year.
I'm gonna share something real quick with you. Let's share this. Share screen. Can you guys see?
Yes.
Evolved because the terrain that they're now focused on is a different type of terrain. So they need long-range fires. You've heard them express a need for tanks. And we are doing everything that we can to get them the types of support, the types of artillery and munitions that will be effective in this stage of the fight. And so we'll get a chance we've done a lot. As you know, you've seen what we've done here in recent past with the recent $800 million authorization provided by the president allows us to provide 5 battalions of 155 howitzers, hundreds of thousands of rounds of artillery. And so we're also engaging our colleagues in other countries for the same type of capability. And we see indications early on that they're going to be, many countries are going to come forward and provide additional munitions and howitzers. So we're going to push as hard as we can, as quickly as we can, to get them what they need. We want to see Ukraine remain a sovereign country, a democratic country, able to protect its sovereign territory. We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. So it has already lost a lot of military capability and a lot of its troops, quite frankly. And we want to see them not have the capability to very quickly reproduce that capability. We want to see the international community more united, especially NATO. And we're seeing that. That's based upon the hard work of, number one, President Biden, but also our allies and partners who have willingly leaned into this with us as we've imposed sanctions, as we've moved very rapidly to demonstrate that we're going to defend every inch of NATO.
I'm going to show you this, right? Because going back to what you're saying, Greta, about education, and how in tune the anti-war movement or peace movement has to be educated on facts on the ground of what's going on. And, we can't be born yesterday activists, right? And that was Lloyd Austin, right? So he's the Secretary of Defense, talking about all the material support that Ukraine is going to get from the West. There have been opportunities to end this war. At the beginning of the war in March, there was an opportunity to end it. There were talks, peace talks, last year, and it was torpedoed. Shortly afterwards, there was another one. It was also torpedoed. The second attempt to end the war, right? Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of UK, did a personal trip to Kyiv and told Zelensky that if he negotiates with Russia, he'll lose all support from the EU and whatnot. So every opportunity to end this, right, has been torpedoed, right? From our perspective here, from where we at, what can we do? How can we highlight that? How can we push our leadership to end this conflict? Because you're in Europe and you're seeing it firsthand how it's happening in Europe, but we don't have the same reaction here, the same nuance, the same analysis here. It appears so. I'll leave it at that and give you the opportunity to answer.
Yeah, no, that's a very telling clip, I think, so many fronts. But so it's interesting just in terms of how things have unraveled in Europe, in particular in Germany, for example. There have been a lot of recent protests with thousands of people demanding an end to, Germany's participation. And I think, what Lloyd Austin was saying about how NATO is united, actually, that wasn't really true at the beginning of the war, right? There was some, fractures about how to go forward and what to do. And it seems like, from what I've read, that the U.S. really forced Germany and others in NATO into a corner, in particular with the Nord Stream bombings, which was recently, published, and we can talk about that. But I think there's a lot of resentment in places like Germany where people rightly see that, the government is just falling lock and step with the U.S. And now that the people are having to pay for it in terms of lack of heat, spiraling prices, inflation, all that stuff. And so the links between all of those things are a bit more obvious, whereas in the U.S., I don't think they are so much put forward and connected by folks in the anti-war movement, which relates to, I think, the core issue is, having links with people in the working class who really don't have an interest in this war and see the day-to-day effects of it, but also the broader capitalist system in their life. I think that's essential to really building a movement that can challenge and demand those things from the government, because I think that's really the only way that we can win those concessions.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm just sort of thinking through as an organizer activist, and I would say that we need to expand the diversity of tactics that we do. That in a sense, the main tactic that I've been seeing in terms of opposition to the Ukraine war is, rallies and petitions. And so I would sort of challenge the anti-war movement and to expand that. And I'm thinking especially of the notion of civilian-based defense and the notion of non-cooperation, which, we've seen historical examples of that. Danish workers under Nazi rule who were making, I think it was weapons parts or something, and they would be working, and then at the end of the day, they would unscrew the bolts to the parts and, have to redo the work over and over again, things like that. Or, for example, we've seen in other movements like boycotts that have been successful. So I just feel that we have this very narrow vision of the tactics, and that's not going to end this war and this larger sort of war machine that we've been talking about. So I'm trying to push us, and I think what I'm saying is a very challenging point, but I think we need to go beyond this normal vision of the tactics. But I think the big challenge too is when you start talking about things like civilian-based defense, boycotts, that kind of thing. It has an impact on us individually. It might mean not shopping for certain products that you usually shop for or whatever it is. And so that's the pressure point, right? Is like, are people going to be able to give up certain comforts to be able to take action on these issues?
Yeah, just to add to what you're saying about recently in Italy, you had dock workers. Dock workers are refusing to load weapons into ships that were heading to Ukraine. Which is another tactic that have been used as well in Europe. Fortunately, not so much here. Shiloh.
Well, I was just really taken back by that clip that you shared. Like a few things stood out, like the term Lloyd Austin used the term colleagues in referring to the people of Ukraine, the people of Russia. Found that interesting and telling. He's just a shill, as we know, for the military-industrial complex. And he's standing in a factory that's like a business factory. I found that really interesting too. And also I found, this hard line that the U.S. and this administration is taking around, we'll defend every inch of NATO. Ukraine's not part of NATO. So what are you actually talking about? I found that really interesting as well.
So I'm gonna show you another clip real quick. Another clip real quick and get your thoughts on it. So she's Lloyd Anderson. She's the South Command commander. And this is what she has to say. This region is Latin America, what she's referring to.
This region is so rich in resources, rare earth minerals, lithium. The lithium triangle is in this region. There are a lot of things that this region has to offer. The Belt and Road Initiative, 21 of the 31 countries are signatories. Over the last 5 years, 2017 to 2021, investment, over 50 billion. I think it might be even closer to 100 billion of Chinese investment in this region. I think they're playing chess. Russia is also prevalent in this region, and I think they're playing checkers. I think they're there to undermine the United States. They're there to undermine democracies, and they all mean business. Whether they're playing chess or checkers, they're there to undermine democracy. And quite honestly, with all of the disinformation and the Russia Today, Espanol, Sputnik Mundo, over 30 million followers on Russia or on social media. I mean, this is very concerning. We have a lot of important elections coming up or just happened, and we have to continue to stay engaged and concerned with this region.
So, but just to give context of what she's saying, going back to the sanctions and all that, and before that, and we're also coming up to the anniversary of 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine this year as well. Monroe Doctrine has been pretty much the gateway to Latin American intervention and wars after wars. I mean, I was in high school when the war and again, the invasion of Panama happened. I remember that vividly. Shortly after that, was the war in Iraq. But what you're saying is, right, that the U.S. finds the concerning that Latin American countries are diversifying their partners, right? You got BRICS, which is an economic bloc of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. You have more and more countries pretty much preferring to do business with Chinese companies and Russian companies, whereas before, if you could think back to the banana republics, where pretty much American companies like the United Fruit Company pretty much ran a country, in Central America, and she found that concerning. So the concern here in Latin America is, right, given that we're seeing a rupture to the international system, we're seeing a rupture of American dominance capital. There are more diversification, there are more blocks and everything like that. That eventually, the U.S. aggression will come back to Latin America, to try to claim dominance again in Latin America, right? Or not again, but to double down on dominance in Latin America. What are your thoughts on that? And how here in the core piece that you say, how does the anti-war or the anti-peace activists, the anti-imperialists, should respond to this, that's, to what she's saying and what seems to be coming next?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about is the economic competition between imperialist powers to redivide the world, and it's not a peaceful process either. And I don't think, the influence of any of the imperialist powers in Latin America is generally positive for the people there. So it's a real question of charting a third way and not reducing things to the one of lesser evils. And I think in terms of how the anti-war movement can respond, I mean, there's a lot of people actually from Latin America in the U.S. that I think know, quite frankly, the disastrous role the U.S. has played in a lot of places and continues to play. And I think there's a lot of, issues too, because some people, don't want to speak out if they're undocumented, that sort of thing. But I think a lot of people from those communities, it would be great to mobilize them and make links with them. But yeah, I think the larger point of just showing that the ventures of the U.S. In any of parts of the world, economic or militarily, are really not in the interests of the people in the U.S. Is I think the fundamental thing we have to grapple with.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. And I think it just emphasizes the importance of global organizing. And again, kind of the perspective that World Beyond War has taken in our work, the approach we've taken in our work, that we need to be activating people from all corners of the planet and having international solidarity to show, that the war machine in any part of the world is not a positive thing from any country. As you said, we don't want to replace U.S. imperialism and the U.S. war machine with any other country's war machine either. And so really the issues that we're talking about is this much larger kind of paradigmatic shift away from the way that the way that our society is structured now to a much more, in my mind, the goal would be a much more localized, community-centered society that could be more self-sufficient on the communal or regional level. And I think the vision that many of us sort of talk about is kind of a global-local dialectic where we have more autonomy on the local level, more, production of our own goods, but then we also live in a globalized world where we could have a structure like the UN or a reformed version of the UN, or there's other models too that World Beyond War talks about, like an Earth Constitution or an Earth Federation. So we do have to act as a global society. We can't totally just disengage, but we need to find some better way to have this global community and then have more local autonomy as well. And I'll just add that World Beyond War is currently looking for a Latin America organizer. So this conversation is quite relevant. We're trying to expand into that region and provide more organizing support in that region.
Just again, just, the striking feminist imperialism that we see a woman forcer general speaking about the military industrial complex. I'm just constantly reminded of the quote from Mark Lamont Hill that like empires don't have friends, they have interests. And I think each of you touched on that over and over again. And I just really appreciate, the conversation and the time.
Just to add to that clip, and the reconfiguration, right? So I don't know if you recall, during the Trump era, and you talking about the migrants and whatnot here in the United States, you also got to consider that they're also, particularly people from, they're also aligned with imperialism. And I'm thinking about South Florida, where the more voter you are in Cuba, the more popular you are in South Florida, right? Now you got the Cuban and the Venezuelan diaspora over there. Under Trump, I don't know if you remember this, from 17 to 18, from 2017 to 2018, right? The maximum pressure sanctions on Venezuela that Trump enacted, according to the United Nations, right? Pretty much killed about 40,000 Venezuelans, right? 40,000 Venezuelans. And that sanction was broken. It was broken, which was enormous, right? It was broken through South-South relations when Iran, for example, sent tankers of foodstuff and everything to Venezuela. Trump threatened with using the U.S. Navy to sink those tankers. So the Iranian government sent also with those tankers of foodstuff and medicines and stuff like that, sent also Iranian naval ships to accompany them. So they came to Venezuela, right? And then following that, we have Russian support. Russia also supported a lot of foodstuff. China supported a lot of foodstuff and everything because of the sanction. The threat of sanction is that if you break the sanction, you'll be sanctioned as well. So regional countries, were afraid of actually supporting Venezuela. We took the initiative of Iran, followed by Russia, followed by China to break those sanctions. So this rupture, this reconfiguration of the earth that we're seeing right now, the world we're seeing right now, just like Greta was saying, because the sanctions also push Venezuela to be more self-sufficient in the food stuff, growing their own stuff. And I saw that in Cuba as well. When I went to Cuba, the sanctions in Cuba, Cuban sanctions since 1960. So it has pushed them to grow their own food stuff on market. See your thoughts on that, and we can close after that.
I mean, I think everything you just said just relates to everything that we've been talking about for this whole conversation. And, we haven't used the term yet, but I think essentially what many of us are talking about is a shift to a multipolar world instead of a unipolar world where the U.S. is at the head of everything.
I think I see it a bit differently. I'm not necessarily, I think, so for me, a multipolar world kind of implies that it's necessary for oppressed countries to align with one or another, imperialist external power. And I think there is, generally speaking, a third way, independent. And I think it's essential to be working towards that and supporting those independent initiatives across the world. And so because I don't see, China and Russia and their kind of influence in around the world as positive, similar to I don't see the influence of the U.S. Across the world as positive. I think they're really all just vying for influence, for markets, for profit, and to exploit people in these different countries. So perhaps we see it a bit differently, but I think that we agree on a lot too, and I think that's okay.
Well, it's an interesting analysis. I'm certainly not, supporting imperialism from a different country, as I agreed with you earlier that I'm not saying we should swap out, U.S. imperialism with Chinese imperialism or anything. So, yeah, I think in a sense we agree with each other. Maybe it's just the terminology difference. But yeah, I'm curious to hear more about your view. Or I hadn't heard the critique of the multipolar world necessarily implying, I certainly didn't mean to imply like supporting imperialism from other countries.
Yeah, and I'm sorry if I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. That's just what for me multipolar world means. The the competition between various powers. So, I mean, I'm curious if you can speak a bit more on kind of the distinction, because I certainly don't think he's for imperialism, but what is the distinction then with multipolar?
Yeah, I guess I was just using the term in a broad brushstroke to mean not one power that has global hegemony the way the US does. So multipolar essentially meaning that, power is shared across many different countries and regions of the world. And I guess also I would, add kind of what I was saying earlier, how in World Beyond Wars materials, we talk about the need for improved international frameworks, improved frameworks of global governance. So I don't know how exactly that fits into this conversation, but I think it is related in the sense of that as we're talking about the sort of breaking apart of the power, we also need reform of our international institutions. As I said, the UN is very flawed, and that's something that we go into on World Beyond War's website. So whether it is reforming or getting rid of the UN and creating a different structure like an Earth Federation, or there's many different models that people have proposed. So I guess the larger point is we need better global governance, and we need to break apart the centers of power to have more distributed power worldwide.
I think that is a good place to pause. Conversation continues. Any closing remarks before we end? I'll start with Anna.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just end on the fact that most people, the overwhelming majority of people in the U.S. Don't have an interest with U.S. imperialism, and there's a basis for them to oppose it. And I think our task is really to unite with those people, connect with those people, and ultimately, I think, have, the interests of the working class really guiding the way the country is run.
Wonderful. Well, it was wonderful to be in conversation with you all today. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. And obviously, these are very large issues that we're grappling with. And I encourage people to go to our website, worldbeyondwar.org, if you want to learn more about our work and get involved.
Just grateful for the conversation and the points that y'all brought today. It was great. Especially at the end there, the discussion around perhaps differing views. Perhaps that was a really wonderful example of how to have conversation, like a generative conversation where you're actually curious and asking questions and not divisive. We don't actually meet eye to eye. It's let's discuss what you mean by this term and break it down. And that was really wonderful. And I just, overall just appreciate each of you, the work that you're doing and the time that you've shared with us.
Yeah, really well said, Shiloh. I just want to say, really, really happy to have been in this conversation. I think, what you're doing, Greta, Giovanni, Shiloh, is amazing. And I'm really excited to stay in contact and keep moving the struggle forward. So, thank you again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you for joining us here at Fortress on the Hill. Hope this conversation continues.
Money is tight these days for everyone, especially in the lingering shadow of COVID. Penny pinching to make it through the month often doesn't give people the funds to contribute to a creator they support. So we consider it the highest honor that folks help us fund the podcast in any dollar amount they're able. Patreons is the main place to do that, and for supporters who can donate $10 a month or more, they will be listed right here as an honorary producer, like these fine folks. Fahim's Everyone Dream, James O'Barr, James Higgins, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hansen, Daniel Fleming, Michael Karen, Ren Jacob, Rick Coffey, Scott Spalding, Spooky Tooth, and the Status Quo podcast. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt for some great Fortress merch. We're on Twitter and on Facebook.com @Fortress on a Hill. You can find our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
Come on, you good people, and listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not